I think you all know my name is Kristlyn Partica, and I'm the project manager for the Northern Grapes Project. Our fifth webinar in the Northern Grape webinar series is titled Keep a Cork in It, Stabilizing Sweet Wines for Bottling. Our speaker tonight is Chris Gerling. Chris is an Extension Associate in Enology at Cornell University. He works with the New York wine industry to create educational programs that support the growth and improved quality of premium wines throughout the state. His role in the Northern Grapes Project is to assist in outreach, such as today's webinar. Remember that as a participant in the webinar, you won't have the ability to speak. However, if you are having any technical difficulties, please type a note in the chat pod over on the left side of your screen, and I will do what I can to help. If you have any questions, please type those in the chat pod as well. Anna Catherine Mansfield, who is an assistant professor of enology at Cornell, is online tonight, and like she said, she can answer some questions in the chat pad during the webinar. And then at the end of the webinar, Chris can also answer some questions that you have. So with that, I think I will turn everything over to Chris. I'm going to switch the layout here and let him get going.
Alrighty, thank you. While we're getting this up, I just want to make sure that everybody can still hear me out there. So just a couple acknowledgments that you can hear me would be great. Alrighty, coming in. Alrighty, great. Well, it sounds like we're ready to go. Coming to you from cloudy, overcast, rainy Geneva, New York. It was in the mid-60s today, but we never saw the sun. Hopefully you had a sunnier day wherever you are. It looks like you're from a lot of different places, so that's pretty neat. So let's get started. So we are talking about wine stability, especially in wines with residual sugar tonight. So when we talk about wine stability, we're talking about a wine that retains its identity, a wine that will be the same wine that you worked so hard on for so long in the cellar. That's the wine that's going to reach your customer, basically. We're talking about wines that look the same, that smell the same, that taste the same. And so that's not too complicated of a concept. There are a few different categories of stability that we talk about when we're talking about wine. And right off the bat, one of the things we're not going to focus on too much tonight is the cold or tartrate stability, the protein or heat stability. Those are important, but not directly related to sugar, so necessarily. So we're not going to deal with those too much tonight. We are going to talk about microbial stability and color and aroma issues, though, as they relate to what can happen to issues with re-fermentation. This is about consumer perception. Luckily, in the wine business, we deal with alcohol and acid, and it's really hard to hurt our consumers. We're not talking about E. coli or listeria, salmonella, those kind of things, luckily. We're talking about offending our customers' sensibilities and preventing them from buying another bottle of wine, which is also an important thing. We're glad we can't hurt them, but we'd like them to be repeat customers, and we'd like them to tell their friends about what great wines they've had. And when their friends go and buy the wine, we'd like that to be the same wine too. And so to achieve that, we want to make sure that the wine that we're presenting is not changing unduly in the bottle. The last thing I'm going to say about stability at this point is that we're trying to make a situation where stability is either minimal or maximal. It sounds a little bit counterintuitive at first, but the idea here is that things that are highly unstable will react before our eyes. They will react in the tank. They will react before anything ever happens where we get to a customer. The reaction will already have occurred. And so that's going to happen on our side of the production process, and that's okay. Now, if we can create a very stable issue where no reactions will occur for a number of years, that's also good. What we're afraid of is what we call metastability, and that's when we have the components necessary to have a reaction, some kind of a problem, but for some reason that is not happening, and we're not sure at what point the conditions may change to make it favorable for reaction again. We don't want to be in that mid-range, that metastable, where we're just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was thinking about the the Western movies where they're outside in the dark and they say, it's quiet, it's too quiet. That's the situation we don't want to be in, where we're afraid that something may happen any time. So the beginning of this process is, of course, the vineyard and the grapes ripening. And so grapes are maturing, and acid levels are decreasing, sugar levels are increasing. These are separate mechanisms, but we kind of think of them along a sliding scale because usually they are commensurate. One is happening in conjunction with the other. And the acid that we are seeing that's reducing later in the year is malic acid primarily. Tartaric acid is mostly fixed, but malic acid is reducing. And if we are talking about grapes that don't reach full maturity, or grapes, especially grapes of some of these cold-hardy varieties that have a lot of acid, naturally, there may be a lot of malic acid in there, and that may lead to pronounced sourness, basically, is what will happen with the wine. And so we may have to deal with that in a number of ways. The sugars we're getting, the vines are photosynthesizing. They're making the sugar, and they're turning the sugar into sucrose. They're combining small molecules into larger molecules, sucrose, and then transporting it to the grape where it gets broken down again into glucose and fructose. And so those are kind of the primary sugars that we will be dealing with. When we taste these sugars at the other end of the spectrum, fructose is the sweetest. Sucrose, which is made up of glucose and fructose, as we said, and sucrose is kind of the reference. Sucrose is table sugar, is the sugar that you put in your coffee. It's the sugar that looks like the picture here. It is less sweet than fructose. It is more sweet than glucose, which kind of makes sense. And so when the thing about sucrose is it will break down in the presence of acid, like in grape juice, and it will become what we call invert sugar, which is just the combination of fructose and glucose. And that combination is sweeter than sucrose, actually, but less sweet than fructose. It's just a combination of these two sugars, and so it's about 20% sweeter than sucrose. So we have all these sugars, and why are we interested in them? Because they have some direct and indirect effects. When we talk about sweetness in isolation, just perceiving sugar alone on your taste buds, there's no smell to sugar, or at least not a smell like you would think of when you think of wine descriptors. And when you taste it, it hits your taste buds. You have a certain sweetness intensity and a certain duration. And that's where I was talking about the previous slide about how fructose tastes sweeter than sucrose and sweeter than glucose and so on. However, there are indirect effects of this that our brain forms when it's experiencing sugar in combination with these other things in the wine that have a lot of benefits for us, especially when we talk about high acid grapes and wines. The presence of sugar makes the other things that we're perceiving, the fruit characters, the raspberry, the cherry, along with sugar, our brain says that there's more of those things when sugar is present. And so that is helpful. And the other just as valuable impact is that it decreases our perception of sourness. And so we look at the lemonade. And if you have just pure lemon juice, that is a pretty sour product, right? That's something you wouldn't want to drink. And so we add the sugar, and eventually there's a balance point where it's no longer so sour, and it can become quite sweet. In some lemonades, we are not removing the acid in any way. We're not reacting with that acid. That acid is still there, but our perception of it is decreasing. And that's why sugar is often a helpful product when it comes to making wines from grapes in a high acid situation. So residual sugar in wines, now that we've talked about the benefits, it can get there in a couple ways. We can have a fermentation that does not run its course, where all the sugar that's present in the grapes is not fermented, and so some remains along with the alcohol. Or all the sugar may get fermented away, but we may choose to add some back. And either of those is valid because of the nature of the sugars we're talking about, and some are sweeter than others. You may have different effects from that. There are ways to simulate in a way, so that we can We know, and we'll talk about in a second, which sugars get left over in a typical fermentation, and so we can try to emulate that if we want, or we can go for different flavors. But the key point is that if you leave sugar, we know that we're going to talk about fermentation and what that means. You shouldn't have yeast or vice versa. And this is when we start to talk about unstable situations. If you've got one, that's one thing, but if you've got both, yeah, you could be asking for trouble. And as we talk about just bringing in sugar, measuring it in grapes, Brix is grams per sugar per 100 grams of juice. It's a weight ratio. It's not a volume ratio. So that's just a subtle point to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that Brix does not directly measure sugar. It measures soluble solids, and it's a slightly different thing. They're not entirely different. Obviously, since we use the measurement, we think it's close enough. It's about 95% of the soluble solids are going to be those fermentable sugars, but just to keep in mind that they are not exactly the same thing. And there are lots of other measures that we can convert to depending on the country you're in and the product you're talking about. People measure this in all sorts of different ways, usually having to do with density. So let's crush these grapes up and make some wine. The other point, as I was saying, is we can add sugar. It's legal in most states. It's not legal in California, but I think it's legal in all the states that I'm talking to now. But check with your local liquor authority to add sugar to increase the final content or to keep it that sugar content and have residual sugar left over. If you want to have a fermentation that stops naturally, but you don't have enough sugar now to get the alcohol and the residual sugar, both the alcohol and the residual sugar that you want, you may be able to chaptalize. And the one thing I would caution against, we're talking about chaptalization, is if you are using one of the northern varieties that is a high sugar accumulator, especially like the Minnesota varieties where you can get 25, 26, 27 Brix, that is going to be a very stressful situation for the yeast. And so I would not advise adding further sugar on top of that because you are now going to really be taxing those yeast. And I think that's probably more than they can handle. So in that situation, you're probably better off if you really want more residual sugar than you could have in that situation, fermenting as dry as possible and then back sweetening. So this is the standard equation here for fermentation. Why we get wine here? We put our sugar in, our fructose and our glucose that have been broken down from sucrose, and we make ethanol and carbon dioxide. And ethanol is what we usually are focusing on, but carbon dioxide becomes important in our it goes that in our discussion. You can see here the foam from a fermentation happening right now, and that's all well and good in a winery. We're concerned with carbon dioxide because we don't want to have issues of people being asphyxiated by it, and that is a legitimate concern. But at least we have a fairly open system, and so the carbon dioxide is escaping and not and not having a lot of effect. But when we close the system by putting it into a bottle with a container, now we're talking about danger, right? Now that carbon dioxide is creating pressure. This is the champagne process, and those have special bottles, special corks. If we leave these yeast and sugar in a wine bottle, in a particular wine bottle, we could have explosions at the dramatic end, and in the less dramatic end, we'll have off flavors and aromas, hazes, sediments, microbial activity gone wild, and that's what we're trying to avoid, if at all possible, because that's probably not going to result in repeat consumers. When we measure these things, I just want to point out real quickly that refractometers are often used when we're measuring Brix, we're measuring grape juice, and bouilliometers are used when we're measuring alcohol and finished wine, and both of these become less accurate when the presence of the other. So refractometers are very quickly go inaccurate during a fermentation when the alcohol shows up. Bouilliometers are not good with very sweet wines. The hydrometers can be useful in this situation, but hydrometers are usually set for certain ranges and just have to make sure you get the right set of hydrometers to measure this, especially during a fermentation. So just to keep in mind that these things are less reliable. So the yeast takes on takes in the sugar, has to take it out of the juice and inside the cell and across the membrane, and so it has a system that does that, and we call it the HXT gene system, and these are genes that regulate how this happens. And there's like 20 or so genes, and it's very complicated, and we're not going to worry about that too much. All we're going to worry about is that these guys work with both glucose and fructose. And if we are looking at these things in isolation on media, synthetic media, where they've got, the yeast population is on a petri dish, and you feed it in some glucose or some fructose, they seem to be equally happy with either one. And so that's kind of noteworthy. But more importantly, when we start to put them into combination with each other, that's when we start to see inhibition. And so when we combine the glucose and the fructose into a synthetic media, for example, they don't perform as well, the system, and particularly they seem to favor glucose. And when we add ethanol, the system favors glucose even more. So it starts to use more glucose than fructose in proportion when we start to put it into a real line situation. And we see this borne out when people do actual fermentations and compare the glucose and the fructose, and they started out even. Remember, sucrose is 1-to-1 glucose to fructose, and we've got broken up sucrose in our line, so we start out with even ratios, and you can see they're right at 1 there, pretty much, in the ratio. But as the fermentation progresses and get towards the end, now the proportion of glucose remaining is like 10% or less of what's left of the entire pool of sugar. So what we have remaining in the wine now is almost entirely fructose, and that's something to think about when you're talking about the flavors and the taste perception, the sweetness perception of a naturally a wine that has stopped a fermentation, quote unquote, naturally. But it's also something to think about for the stability of the system. And this is what we call a metastable system, because you say, well, the fermentation has stopped, and it seems like the system doesn't want to deal with this fructose, but we're afraid that it will figure it out given enough time. Other things that inhibit the yeast, pH, nutrients, temperature, all these things are important. And as we send more and more challenges at the yeast, as we make the environment tougher and tougher on them, they're going to have more and more trouble fermenting, taking in that sugar. The HXT, the transport system, is going to get more and more stress on it, and we're going to have a harder time getting through the fermentation. And so when we're trying to make sure that we complete the fermentation, if that's our goal, then we want to make sure that we take care of all these issues. And even when you're trying to stop a fermentation, stressing it too much can be dangerous, because yeast stress can lead to other issues besides just a lack of fermenting the sugar. And just remember that this is, we call it a geometric, not additive manner. So when you start to add these issues on top of each other, you're actually multiplying the stresses. And that brings us to yeast assimilable nitrogen, which is, nitrogen is kind of the primary macronutrient after sugar that the yeast need to carry out a successful fermentation. There are lots of things in the vineyard that dictate what the yeast assimilable nitrogen will be. Vineyard nitrogen, your nitrogen status, your petiole tests and soil tests and tests that you take looking at your vine nitrogen status, those do not correlate directly with your yeast assimilable nitrogen level. Just keep that in mind. So you may have to supplement your yeast assimilable nitrogen, even if your vines are okay, and that doesn't mean anything is wrong. That's just typical. We're still trying to come up with better predictors of what the vineyard status means for the yeast assimilable nitrogen status. That guy in that picture right there, that's part of his project in graduate school to do that. So that's something we're working on. And so where I'm getting around to is that when we start to talk about, once again, these Hybrix varieties, when we think about a normal situation of fruit that is somewhere 20 to 22 Brix, then 150 to 250 milligrams per liter of yeast assimilable nitrogen is considered sufficient. But as we raise the amount of sugar that we're talking about, we raise the job that the yeast is going to have to do is getting more difficult, and there's going to be more alcohol and things like that. we need more nitrogen. And so when we look down at this chart, we see like the frontenac in the third row here. It's got 234 ppm of yeast-soluble nitrogen, which, as we talk about, is ideal for a normal situation. But at 26.7 bricks, it's probably not enough. And so we're actually going to have to maybe supplement that. And so that's just something to be aware of. If you're dealing with some of these high sugar varieties, you're going to need to supplement further with nitrogen. And there are recommendations usually from your suppliers that go along with this. Okay, so now we've talked about healthy fermentation and making sure it completes. What if we don't want it to complete? What if we want to stop it? And we want to retain some of that sugar? We've got enough alcohol, and we'd like to retain some of the sugar. And so the best way to do that is with temperature. That's the most effective way, the safest way to do things, the easiest way to do things, if that's your choice. Adding SO2 is a tricky proposition. And so my metaphor is, if you're riding a bike, you can use the brakes, which is temperature, or you can find a stick and put in the spokes, which is what SO2 is going to do. And both of those will stop the bike, but you'll like the results a lot more with the brakes than with the stick and the spokes. The yeast, actively fermenting yeast, faced with lots of SO2, are going to start producing lots and lots of acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a kind of an oxidative smell. It's a chemical compound associated with sherry, and it also is a binder of SO2. It's going to bind your SO2 further, so you're going to need even more SO2 when you finally stop the fermentation, because of all the acetaldehyde that has been produced by the SO2. So it's a tough thing. And so if you can use temperature, then that's your best thing. And as cold as you can get it, I see being asked down there, probably for all intents and purposes. If we're talking about tanks, as cold as you can get it is going to be, down close to freezing Fahrenheit, 32 Fahrenheit, if you can get it down there. And that also helps the yeast to settle down at the bottom, because the yeast, filtration is another way. If you can separate the yeast from the juice, from the wine, obviously that's another way to stop the fermentation. But it's really hard to just filter an active fermentation, because the yeast are all over the place, and so you've got this very colloidal mixture that's not going to, the filter will not be happy with. And so if you can chill it down, you can make sure that the yeast are going to settle down, and then it's going to be much easier to filter or rack or whatever it is you're going to do. So that's my soapbox on that. While we're talking about SO2, we should always talk about SO2. SO2 is an important part of what we do, and it's an important part of winemaking. SO2 does lots of things for us, and it is something that we need to use judiciously as part of a program with making wine that's going to have residual sugar in it, because SO2 is part of our toolkit. It's not the only tool, as I just discussed, for that reason and for others, which we will, but it is part of what we're going to do, because maintaining your SO2 at the right levels is important. And the right levels, what does that mean? It means that based on our pH, we need different amounts of free SO2. Part of the free SO2 is the molecular SO2. The molecular SO2 is what is giving us the microbial control that we're after here. And so the higher your pH, the more SO2 you're going to need. And you probably know that, but it's important to keep it in mind. And the good news is, with these northern varieties, that usually our pH tends to be lower. So we don't have to worry about that so much. But this is just something to keep in mind. And so when I get around to, the key is that SO2 is a gatekeeper when we talk about managing microbes and spoilage. It is the barn door, I say. We're trying to keep the right things. If you close the barn door after the animals have left or after the bad guys have gotten in, closing the door doesn't do you a whole lot of good. But if you can close the door and keep things where they're supposed to be, that's when it's the most effective. And it's the same thing with SO2. SO2 is very good at preventing microbial growth that we don't want, but it is much worse at stopping microbial growth. And things like Brettanomyces and other spoilage and bacteria issues like that, SO2 is far more effective at preventing those things than it is at catching them once they've gotten out of hand. And so that's just keep in mind with SO2. So as we've talked about, we are trying to make wine. We don't want to have both yeast and sugar because they are a dangerous combination. But we've elected, since we're making wine, that we feel like we need some residual sugar. We've chosen the sugar to keep in. We're going to have to get the microbes out. We're going to have to get the yeast and the bacteria out, whichever ways we can. And so there are a few options that we have to do that, to accomplish that. And the best one, probably the easiest one in the long run, although it seems complicated in the short run, is filtration, good filtration. And filtration can provide a host of benefits for us, like the ones listed here on the sheet. So they, besides, it gives us both visual impact and also this microbial control. It can remove things that we don't want in there. And so, we think that this is really the way to go. Now, people have concerns about filtration. It's bandied about in all areas of the wine industry, from people who've been in the industry for decades to people who are just getting into it, people who make very expensive wine, to people who make all different kinds, that filtration is going to strip the wine. It's going to take out things that we want in there. It's going to ruin it in some way. It's going to remove these great flavor compounds. And I can't say flat out that that's not true, but I can say that all the evidence we have points to the fact that that's probably not true, in scientific speak, of course. First of all, these volatile compounds, these terpenes, and all these other things that we measure, that we talk about as contributing to the flavor of wines, are too small to fit through any kind of pore that you're ever going to filter through. These 0.2, 0.45 micron pore sizes. That's far too large for any of these aroma compounds in a direct kind of way. Now, there is, when we talk about depth filtration, which we'll talk about more in a second, there is the aspect of a charge on the filter media, and so that some compounds that may be smaller in the pore size may still be attracted and trapped by the media. That could happen, but as far as we can tell, it doesn't happen. And furthermore, there may be some compounds that are associated with mouthfeel. That's more plausible because some of those compounds are larger, especially as they polymerize. Some tannin structures, things that could contribute to astringency and like that. But we still don't see that happening too much either. And so David Block teaches at UC Davis. He teaches winery operations. And so he recently did a trial that he presented at the RAVE, which is their Recent Advances in Viticulture and Enology meeting, where he did a trial where he used the bottling line with and without the final filtration membrane, the sterile cartridge, and then they ran chemical tests and sensory tests on the wine to see what would happen, with and without. And on neither the chemical nor the sensory test could they find any kind of measurable difference between those wines. So that's, so if that is your concern, hopefully you can sleep a little easier knowing that. I can't guarantee that no wine ever has been or ever will be affected by a filtration step, but properly carried out filtration does not seem to be something that's going to hurt your wine, in any kind of a measurable way. So talking about these types of filtration, for those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about, we have two main types that we usually discuss. And so we have depth filtration, which is usually used first with a wine that has never been filtered before. And this offers what we call a tortuous path for the molecules that we're trying to remove. It is rated in a nominal fashion, which means that the average pour size is in the range that you'll buy it in, but there's no guarantee that that every pour size is a particular is the particular size. It's an average because it's using it's using the depth, and it's using the path, and it's using the charge of the media to remove most all of these molecules or whatever they are that you're trying to remove, sediments and such. And the advantage to this is surface area, right? You can see all the surface area. It allows for greater throughput, and so you can get lots of gallons of wine through this media without too much concern about clogging. Whereas when we get down to what we call absolute filtration, where you have a surface and every one of these pores is one set size and nothing smaller or nothing larger than that pore size is going to pass through, that's the final filtration, and it's an absolute filtration, but this one surface offers much less surface area and a much greater chance for fouling and for clogging with a similar throughput. So that's why we want to use the surface filtration first and then use this later. And hopefully the idea is that we will remove 99.9% of the offending bugs or whatever we're trying to get out with the depth filtration, so that the surface filtration, and what we usually hear is this is usually the cartridge membrane 0.45 micron on your bottling line, for example, is usually what this is. And hopefully that doesn't have to work very hard. If you've done the filtration with the depth filtration and everything has gone well, then this is kind of an insurance policy to just pick off the last couple of whatever might have gotten through. And you hopefully will get a lot of life out of this relatively expensive membrane. The 0.45, absolute membranes are pretty expensive, and so we don't, we want to not work them too hard. We want to work the cheap pads or the diatomaceous earth or whatever it is that we're using for the depth filtration. Those are less expensive, and so we're hopefully going to have those do the work for us. Now, there's a way to combine kind of the benefits of the depth filtration and the surface filtration into one item, and that is a cross-flow filter. And as we saw previously, we saw the fluid approaching our surface or our membrane or our media and going right into it. And that's the traditional way that we do these things. But as you can see on a cross-flow, we're moving at a 90-degree angle to the surface, to the media. And what that allows for is it allows for less particles to settle on the membrane and onto the media, so we can get greater throughput in that way with less fouling. And also, it's a relatively easy thing to flush in the opposite direction to push backwards against this fluid flow and brush off kind of all of these molecules. And so that helps us get increased throughput as well. And so with a cross-flow filter, you can take a wine that has had no filtration and go to final filtration level in one pass, often. Not all the time, but most of the time. And so that's a pretty snazzy thing. Now, the catch is, of course, these filters are expensive. They're usually, I think $10,000 might be the least expensive one I've ever seen. And so we're talking about serious money, but the upside to that is it allows you to forego the other filtration steps I've talked about. You probably still want a cartridge on your bottling line, but you're not going to have to deal with the pads or the diatomaceous earth. And diatomaceous earth, especially, is seeing increased scrutiny because it is a carcinogen, not because it's radioactive or anything like that, but because like any powder, it's subject to being breathed in, and so breathing any powder into your lungs can lead to cancer. And so a lot of wineries are trying to go away from the diatomaceous earth, and so the cross-flow filters will probably become more and more prevalent. And the good news is they seem to be getting cheaper and smaller And so hopefully people are realizing that they could sell a lot more of them since there are a lot of small wineries out there. If we're not going to use a filter or we're not going to use a lot of filtration, the next thing that most people use in a sweet wine situation is sorbate, sorbic acid. It is often used as a preservative, and you see that it inhibits yeast. It does not kill the yeast. And so that's, harkening back to kind of the metastable situation we were talking about previously. This is a concern. Depending on your use load and your storage conditions, this is an inhibition. You are not wiping out all the yeast or in other way, doing anything to them. You're just inhibiting them from carrying out further mischief. Potassium sorbate is what we most commonly add. The legal limit is 300 milligrams per liter, and the sensory threshold is 135 milligrams per liter. And what that sensory threshold means, we'll talk about more in the next slide. But what it means is that people can notice it at lower levels than we're adding, and so that's important. And adding less so that people won't go below this sensory threshold is not a winning strategy, because the reason you're adding it is because you're trying to inhibit the yeast and you want to add enough to do the job. So adding less is shooting yourself in the foot, because now you're adding something that you don't need to add and it's not even doing its job. So we'll talk about that a little more. And the other thing to remember, as in the box, is that Saccharomyces is the yeast that we inoculate with most often. It's kind of the wine yeast that we buy, when you buy yeast. Brettanomyces and Zygosaccharomyces are considered spoilage yeast and film yeasts, and sorbate is less effective against those, and so that's a concern, because these are spoilage issues, spoilage yeast, and so we are not getting protected against them with sorbate to nearly the same extent. Whereas if we could filter, we can remove. Filter doesn't care what kind of yeast it is; it only cares how big it is. So we talked about what potassium sorbate does, and now let's get back to that sensory threshold issue and what I was talking about. So at 30 to 40% of the population, a sizable minority of the population can tell the difference between, if you have a wine, whatever kind of, a white wine, you treat it with sorbate, between 3 and 4 people in 10 can smell those two wines and say, yes, they're different. I can smell that you've changed it somehow. It's not necessarily a bad smell or taste. That's not necessarily unpleasant, but it is different. They can perceive that difference. And so that's just something to consider. Is that what I want to, am I willing to add it to my wine? Depending on the style of your wine, this character may be not unwelcome, or it may be, a little bit distracting. We're talking usually about a candied, synthetic fruit, artificial fruit, Jolly Rancher, artificial pineapple flavor kind of smells that people are talking about. So not super unpleasant, but different. Now further, these guys are going to degrade to ethyl sorbate. Potassium sorbate will degrade to ethyl sorbate. This will happen all the time. The factors it needs are, the potassium sorbate which you've added, water, alcohol, and time. And every wine has water, every wine has alcohol, every wine has time. That's what they all have in common. So this will happen. Ethyl sorbate, everybody can perceive. It's more of this kind of candied fruit character, and so everybody will start to pick up on that character. Once again, not necessarily bad, but different. And then finally, when we're talking about potassium sorbate, we keep saying it inhibits yeast. It inhibits yeast. What about bacteria? And what about bacteria? Unfortunately, bacteria are not inhibited at all, and they are actually not inhibited to the point where you could say that they eat the stuff. They metabolize it. And when they do, they create this 2-ethoxyhexa-3,5-diene. And you don't need to remember that, but what you do remember is it's going to make your wine smell like crushed geranium leaves. And so we call this geranium taint. And so when lactic acid bacteria are present and they have sorbate to chew on, we get this this geranium off aroma. Once again, we're not talking about super unpleasant things, but we are talking about things, this is not the wine that you made anymore. And so you're probably not going to be too thrilled to have this character show up. The threshold for this, we were looking at grams per liter, I believe, or milligrams per liter, 100 milligrams per liter, so that's parts per million, 135. When we see this geranium tank, that's PPT, that's parts per trillion. And now we're talking about very small amounts. Now we start to talk about drops in 12 Olympic-sized swimming pools or bathtubs in large lakes, that would, doesn't take very much is the key here. And so if you have any of this action at all, you're probably going to have noticed that geranium taint. So these are just things to think about when you're using sorbate. So finally, what can we do about this? Well, you don't have to use it all the time. If you have a dry wine and you have no sugar, no measurable sugar, less than ½ gram per liter, down to, off the measurable charts there, then you shouldn't need sorbate because the yeast are not going to ferment because they don't have sugar to work on. They don't have any food. And then if you have a good filtration, then once again, you won't have any yeast or bacteria. So it doesn't matter, if you've got sugar because now the yeast are gone. So once again, you do not need sorbate. If you decide you are going to use it, make sure you use it with good SO2 levels because SO2 inhibits lactic acid bacteria as effectively as it inhibits anything. So that's important. And make sure you use one strong single dose right before bottling, not over a long period of time. Just like SO2, we don't want to use these things sometimes. We prefer not to, so we're kind of hesitant. You're looking the other way while you're adding these things in because it makes you nervous, and so you don't just go ahead and do it. But if you decide to use these things, go ahead and do it right. Do it completely. Yeah. All right. So if you really do want to kill everything, Velcorin, dimethyl dicarbonate is a possibility. And this is going to kill everything. This will kill yeast. This will kill bacteria. This will kill, I say, not just microbes, but macrobes. And that is, animals and people too. And so that's why we have to be very careful with this. The good news about it is once it kills everything in the wine, it breaks down quite rapidly. It's designed to break down to things that are safe, that are odorless, that are it's basically water and a couple of things. So it will, after 4 hours at room temperature, 2 hours at warmer temperatures, it'll be gone. It will everything will be safe again. But it is a fairly toxic chemical, and so to use it, we need dosing devices that are also sold by these companies. And those are quite expensive because they are, you have to be very, very careful with it. And so it becomes actually, and it becomes, in the wrong hands. They won't sell it to you unless you have the dosing device. So this is something juice manufacturing is big into this right now because it's a great way to have a quote-unquote kill step when you're not going to have any alcohol present and you want to wipe out pathogens as well. And it's something to consider, but not for one small winery. It's something for an association or something, or a mobile system to think about. But it is out there, just so you know. Lysozyme is something that is good for bacteria, for lactic acid bacteria. It could be a good 1-2 punch with sorbate because you're going to get rid of the lactic acid bacteria, and then you can use the sorbate with a little more confidence. It comes from egg whites. There's actually I've seen that it's allowable for organic producers because it comes from egg whites. You probably want to make sure that the one you get does come from. It has no activity against yeast though or gram-negative bacteria. So acetobacter and other things like that, these are still going to be issues you have to consider. So lysozyme is a partial solution, not a full solution, but a partial solution. And the other thing, it is an enzyme, it is a protein, and then bentonite removes proteins from wine, so it will also remove lysozyme if you add it too close in concert. Now, maybe you want to get rid of lysozyme because you want to add malactic bacteria, then it's a good idea to add the bentonite, but don't add bentonite and lysozyme at the same time because you will have only added bentonite, basically. Keep that in mind. All right, so we've gone through all these things, and so people say, you know, how's this going to turn out? The fermentation stopped, as we said. You know, it stalled. I couldn't get it started again, so why should I be worried that there's going to be re-fermentation issues if nothing I tried could make this happen? Or, you know, we're not using sorbate. We're just going to use the filtration this time. Or I saw that the membrane probably wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing. I'd done other filtration, but the membrane didn't work. You know, will I be okay? And so that's where I direct you to the picture on the right there. Maybe, maybe not. That's, you know, we do the best we can, but, you know, we're going to have all different situations that are hard to predict, and including how the customer will store the wine. And so it's really hard to predict these things. But, you know, what I can say is for people who say, well, the fermentation stopped and we couldn't get it started again, so, you know, that's the poster child for what I call metastable. And more than one person has found out that for some reason, putting in the bottle has cured that problem, and the fermentation started again, and the cork started to pop. Skipping sorbate, as we talk about that. People say, well, how much sugar? At what point should I add sugar? You know, should I add sorbate? Is it 3% residual sugar, 4% residual sugar, 5% residual sugar? You know, intuitively, when we think about this, we think, you know, when I get more and more sugar in there, okay, maybe now it's time for sorbate. But when you come back and think about how filtration works and whether it works or not, it doesn't matter how much sugar you put in there, because if the yeast are gone, then that sugar is safe, right? And so 5% is not less safe than 4%, not less safe than 3%. And furthermore, if your filtration has failed or something has gone wrong, it doesn't matter whether you have 3% or 2% or 4%, because you've got yeast and you've got sugar, and they are going to get, you know, they're going to cause problems. So it's not about the level of sugar; it's about what you've done to prevent the sugar and the yeast from what you've done to keep them apart. And so that's, you know, that's kind of where it is. And so when we get these questions, you know, the answer is always maybe. And so we're trying to limit the situation. You know, hopefully if you do a really good job, you can afford to have little things go wrong and you can still get away with it because you've decided, you know, you put the probabilities in your favor. You know, you've done good sanitation, and you've made sure that you've tested your filter with a bubble point test and things like that. You know, you're going to have, you know, you'll tend to have better luck when you put yourself in that position. Finally, when we talk about how to label these wines that we're leaving residual sugar in, how should we label them? Dry, semi-dry, you know, sweet, whatever. First of all, it's up to you because it's not regulated. So you need to, you can come up. You don't need to. You can come up with your own system. What I draw attention to the International Riesling Foundation scale, because what they do is it's a ratio of sugar to acid, which is important because that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about some of these high acid wines. You may not be setting out to make a quote unquote sweet wine, but sugar may be necessary to balance that acid, and so it may not be perceived as sweet. And so what does 1% residual sugar, 10 grams per liter, mean when we're talking about a wine? Well, it depends on how much acid and how much alcohol and all the things, all the other characteristics of the wine. About, you know, that wine could taste sweet. It could taste totally, you know, not sweet at all, depending on the rest of the wine. And so, you know, it's up to you to find that balance, and that's kind of some of the fun of winemaking. So in the end, you know, you have to do what you think is best for the wine. I think we're about at the end here. Stability, when we're talking about wine, you know, it's a function of the food for the organisms and what there is, and the organisms that are there to eat it. And we're trying to keep those two separate. and what level you want to go to when it comes to filtration and sorbet and all those kind of things is the amount of risk you think you can tolerate. How far away from your tasting room is your wine going to get? And your hope, I think we all hope that it'll get a long ways. It'll go, across states and across countries, and people will take it with them. And so we're hoping that in all those situations, it will remain as unchanged as possible. We can't control everything. We can't control how it'll be stored or how it'll be transported all the time, but we can control the situation we put it in. And so that's what I think I'm trying to, hammer home here is so. But if it's up to you to also decide what helps you sleep at night. And so, at the end I say I'm not in marketing, but I know that when we talk to the marketing people, repeat customers are like gold, right? Because they are your brand ambassadors, they are your regular revenue stream, they are, they're doing a lot of your work for you. They are taking your wine to parties, they're taking your wine to their friends, and all these kind of things. And so those are the people that we want to encourage to keep buying our wine. And so we want to make sure they have the same experience and good experiences as much as possible, which I don't have to, I think you all know that. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and we can start talking.
Okay, before we move on to questions, I just want to let everyone know that the PDF of tonight's presentations is once again available in the file share pod. And also, please click on the link in the upper right corner of the page here and take our survey before you completely sign out tonight. So for questions, we had one from Robert, and he was asking, what do you think of cold stabilization for clarifying, polishing, etc.? Yes.
Cold stabilization? Okay, so cold stabilization is where we're going to chill the wine down and possibly seed it with some potassium bitartrate or something to get the, make sure we get all the tartrates out and remove those crystals. So we're not going to have the formation of tartrate crystals in the bottle. And, I think that cold stabilization is an effective means for doing just that, reducing the chance of that crystallization happening. It's not going to take the place of another fining or a filtration, though. I mean, it will help settle things to the bottom. The chilling, as I said, just like with the stopping of fermentation, it's going to help to reduce kind of activity and get things to sink down to the bottom. I think that it can be useful in that respect, but it doesn't replace filtration, and it doesn't replace other methods of stabilizing the wine.
And then we also have one from Jeff, and he asks, I am aware of winemakers who will add, as a rule of thumb, 1 gram per liter of sugar to a dry red wine to heighten sensory elements of that wine. If I don't have sterile filtration equipment and don't want to add sorbate if I've put the red wine through ml, what are my options here if I'd like to do the same?
Well, we're going back to probability here. You have some sugar, not necessarily a lot, but if you have not filtered and you have not added sorbate, you have achieved meta stability. You have a situation where things could happen. It's probably not enough sugar to cause corks to pop necessarily. You're probably not going to create enough carbon dioxide, but can you have the problem is not necessarily now your Saccharomyces, your regular yeast, but do you have other yeasts that are in there that are going to have food and are going to start to metabolize that sugar and maybe create smells, maybe create sediments, maybe create hazes. And it's all maybes. I can't guarantee that will happen or that won't happen. But in that situation, if you don't have any of those controls, then I would say I would want to avoid that 1 gram per liter addition without those controls, I guess, to be safe. be sure. Now
it looks like Jeff might be asking a little bit of a follow-up there. So
is asking about more SO2? Maybe. Increasing your SO2 is definitely, is part of that, but at some point the SO2 itself will become a problem in the red wine. It'll start to bleach the color a little bit, potentially, and you're also, now you're running the risk of people perceiving that SO2 in your wine, if you've got too much in there. And so, I think the SO2 might help, but I think that it's going to override your addition of that 1 gram per liter. The sensory impact of the SO2 will be greater and more negative than that 1 gram per liter, especially close to bottling. Depending on how long you lay that wine down.
Okay, and then we have a question from David. Looks like he's asking about the differences between the nitrogen sources that you can add, DAP versus some of the other superfood additives that are available. So I guess, which one would you prefer or recommend?
People use a combination. So when we're talking about yeast assimilable nitrogen, back when I was talking about the nutrients, there's kind of 2 components to that. We call it the inorganic and the organic component. Ammonia, DAP is ammonia. It's diammonium phosphate. It's primarily NH4, and we call that inorganic because there's no carbon basically attached to that NH4. And then we have the more complex nutrients, which are amino acids basically, which is the primary amino nitrogen or alpha amino nitrogen. And so it depends on how much nitrogen you have and how much nitrogen you're adding, what you want to do. We think of the ammonia, the NH4, as kind of junk food. The yeast like it, but they use it up fairly rapidly. So if you add a whole bunch of DAP right at the beginning of fermentation, the concern is always that the yeast are going to kind of go crazy. They're going to throw a party. They're going to eat it. They're going to create a big biomass, and then they're going to kind of starve out because they've created all these yeast who are hungry now, and they've used up all the nitrogen as the fermentation progresses. So usually it's the organic sources are considered kind of a more balanced diet that the yeast will use a little more judiciously and will kind of last them longer. Kind of like, I don't know, trail mix versus Cheetos or something like that. But depending on how much nitrogen you need, you may need both. And so there's really good recommendations. Scott Labs, I know, has good recommendations for how to use them. And so it's a combination of them. We tell people not to use just the DAP usually in isolation,
Okay, and then we also have a question from Antonio who asks if he could use potassium bicarbonate to drop the acid and therefore need much less sugar.
Yes, you totally can. So we didn't even get into that, and I should have mentioned, that obviously if we, besides adding sugar, we could reduce the acid. And that's an entirely different topic in another webinar. And I think Anna Catherine and Merle may have gotten into that somewhat in theirs. Yeah, so we can reduce acid with potassium bicarbonate chemically or with malolactic fermentation with biologically. So we can definitely we can do those things to reduce the acid. The catch is that in these wines, in these northern wines, potassium bicarbonate acts only on tartaric acid. And so if you have a lot of malic acid and not much tartaric, then by proportion, you may end up not being able to get as far as you want purely with acid additions. But you can certainly, as part of your toolkit, do an acid reduction and then have less sugar in the wine if that's your goal. You can do that.
Okay, it looks like Anna Catherine is talking with Steve regarding that he's getting a pH change in his wine. So you might want to look at those comments, Chris. They're at the very bottom of the chat pod there.
Okay. pH change from sugar additions. That's quite a change. For just adding sugar. I think Anna Catherine is trying to get to the bottom of that right now. That doesn't, you know, just adding sugar should not account for a point, you know, almost 0.3 pH change. That, you know, a fair amount of potassium bicarbonate, you know, to reduce your acidity, your total acidity, as Antonio was talking about, that could cause that kind of a pH change. But I don't think just adding sugar should do that.
Okay, well, it looks like that Anna Catherine and Steve are kind of working through that issue on the chat pod, and I think that Chris has answered all of the other questions. So with that, I would like to remind everyone once again to please fill out the post-webinar survey. We really do value your input, so the link is there in the top right corner of the screen. I would also like to say a big thank you to Chris for doing the webinar tonight. I think that everyone got a lot of really good information out of it, and also thanks to Anna Catherine for being available to answer some questions in the chat pod as the webinar progressed. So with that, I think I will officially end the webinar, and I think Anna Catherine and Chris will be around for a few more minutes online. So thank you everyone very much for participating, and have a good evening. Good night.
Everybody, I'm going to mute, but I'll still be around to type for a couple more minutes.